So today we are going to do international humanitarian law. How important is this for our UPSC law optional means is that we do get questions and the chances of getting questions in upcoming mains is very high. Not only this mains, even to 2027 mains, it is quite important. The reason is because this law is very closely related to wars. And today in international scenario, wars are today's headlines, current affairs. So any current affairs will always make place in your mains paper. So this topic per se is very important for your upcoming mains. Okay. So basically, when we talk about war, we always think missiles are very dangerous. The brutality of war goes with the shooting, the missiles, even an atomic bomb. But the reality is different. For that insights, let me give you an happening which happened in Europe. Before that, welcome to Law Experts MV India. So we will start our class now. The insights that I'm going to give happened in Europe. We know about today's Europe. Today's European Union is telling to India that abolish death penalty. Death penalty is inhuman. The mouthpiece of human rights era is today's Europe. But the same Europe back in history has committed this heinous crime. Okay, what happened? There was a country which invaded the enemy's territory. Okay, so it was an occupied area. What we call an occupied area? If somebody is going to occupy the enemy's territory, say for example, there is X state and India is going to occupy the X state in war, it means it is an occupied territory. So when they invaded and won the war, they killed all the men over there. Whoever participated, non-participants, you are a man, we are going to kill everyone. They had a peaceful death, I will say. Okay, comparing to the next thing. And they caught hold of all the women and separated the women from their children. Be it a 1 month child or 2 days child, 1 year, 5 years, everybody separated. Mothers separate, children separate. And they were separated and they were locked inside a big godown like structure. Okay. And what happened for the mothers? They brought something to eat. And this was so much fishy that, like, it was so dark in color and it was not edible at all. It was smelling so bad. And all the mothers refused to eat it. Immediately, on gunpoint, they were forced to finish their meal. Okay. Once when the mothers, half of them puked, but they were made to eat. Okay. So after that, one of the mothers asked, see, you gave us something to eat. My daughter, my son would be hungry as well. So did you give something to eat for them, please? She started pleading. And immediately the soldiers there, we shall not call them soldiers. Okay. The people there started laughing and they told that what you ate now is your children. You see the audacity. They didn't kill the person. Killing a person by putting a bullet inside is simple in war, I tell you. Okay, you see today's war crimes, they are heinous. But they destroyed the soul of that person. Is this is necessary to win a war? To win a war, yes, you drop bombs, you kill people. That itself is condemned. But that's okay when compared to all these inhuman atrocities. So war comes with ugly nature, but what soldiers do in the occupied territory in the cover up of war is more uglier. To stop that, we need a separate set of rules and international framework, which is called as international humanitarian law. So, apart from being a civil servant, as a person per se, you must know all these happenings and be informed of some law is there. Don't question whether it is active or not, whether it is curbing people or not. At least there is something to say that it is wrong. Don't do it, right? So that set of international humanitarian law, today we are going to decipher. So welcome. Let's start today's class. Hope the screen is visible. If it is not visible, please let me know. Okay. So now let me scroll on top. Yes, our topic is international humanitarian law. So what do you mean by international humanitarian law? It is actually setting rules for humanitarian reasons, because war, you kill a person. What is the military purpose? You want to win a war, you kill the military personnel, you kill the person who's attacking you, you go capture the place. That is enough to win the war. People are not doing that. They are doing human rights violations, which is totally inhuman. So basically, international humanitarian law is created for humanitarian reasons to limit the effect of armed conflict. You see, they did not employ the word war because war needs declaration from the countries and all. But armed conflict is something of wider nature than the war. So international humanitarian law not only applies to war, it also applies to any armed conflict. I will explain what is an armed conflict, but remember it has a wider connotation than war. Okay. So international humanitarian law is what? It is formed on the basis of, for the reason of humanity. And what is the idea of it, aim of it? It is to reduce the effect of armed conflict. Okay, that you have to remember. It is very useful for your introduction purpose. Okay. And when we talk about IHL, International Humanitarian Law, we also call it as the law of the wars or the law of the armed conflict. Whatever name is prescribed in your UPSC paper, do identify immediately it is talking about international humanitarian law. Okay. So how do you limit the effect of armed conflict? How do you do it? Because see, war is inevitable in international scenario. That too, in today's scenario, war is inevitable. But how do you lessen the impact of war? That is very important. We always have this saying, right? All is fair in love and war. Definitely, it is not fair. In love, you cannot cheat and say that it is love. Likewise, in war, you cannot crush human soul and say that it is war. Fight like a gentle person. I don't say that gentleman or a gentle woman. As a gentle human being, you fight like a human, not like a. See, we cannot call those persons animals as well, because animals are far more loving than these people. So don't be like, like a demon. Okay, don't fight a war like a demon. That's what humanitarian law says. So how do you limit? By protecting who are not taking part in the war, protecting the non-combatants. Someone is going to fire an AK-47 against you, then yes, you can wage a war, you can fight that person. Someone is not even fighting. The person is a normal person who's staying in that area. He's a civilized person. Then why are you going to harm that person? So who are not or no longer participating in the hostility must be protected. That is one idea. Next, impose limits on the means and methods of war. Yes, they can come drop the missiles like they dropped in UAE, Iran, Iraq. Yes. Okay, that's wrong, but it's okay. But imagine doing a biological warfare, chemical warfare, dropping atomic bombs. Here we are not talking about atomic bombs, talking about nuclear weapons. We have a separate class. But in case I am telling, you do the war, but the means of doing the war and methods of warfare is controlled in this international humanitarian law. Okay, so what is the purpose? Is to limit the armed conflict. That is, the effect of armed conflict must be limited. That is the idea. Why we are doing that? What is the purpose? For the humanitarian purpose. And how we are doing that is by doing these two things. By clearly understanding the concepts and keywords, how you relate, that's how you get good marks. Okay, what is the aim? what is the purpose, and how we achieve the aim. 3 areas we covered for your introduction purpose. Now, let me tell you whether war is legal or not. Particular nation is getting into war. Whether the war is legal or not, that is not the question of international humanitarian law. The legality of war is decided by the UN Charter, and the UN's role is that. But humanitarian law is something different. In the armed conflict, how do you fight? What, to what extent you can affect the people? That is the idea of international humanitarian law. It doesn't talk about legality of war. That is very important. So you put a heading like this, scope of international humanitarian law, and you specifically mention this. Okay, you can get good marks. Now coming to previous year question, because you always know our classes are structured by previous year question. Why I am doing that? Because that's how UPSC is questioning. Okay, we dance to the tune of UPSC, clear and go. That's all. Okay. So what it is asking? What is the essential difference between international humanitarian law and international human rights law? By this time, you must have got a question. See, we have human rights law. How humanitarian law is different from this human rights law? I'll tell you how. This was asked in UPSC itself, so we have to know it. Give the introduction what I have told just now, and then start your bifurcation. Divide the page as two, put a column, and start writing. Okay. Now, if you talk about international humanitarian law, it applies only during the situation of armed conflict. You can ask me whether international humanitarian law is applicable today in India. I will say no. We don't have any armed conflict. But in case there is an armed conflict in Dubai, we have armed conflict, civil war going in Sudan. There we had earlier in Sri Lanka. Civil wars are going on, right? So if there is an armed conflict, then only international humanitarian law comes into picture. Okay. But if you talk about international human rights law, it applies in war and also in peace. It is perennially available everywhere. Today in USA, there is application of international human rights law. You go to Uganda, Africa, yes, HRL, international human rights law is always applicable. It is not just coming only during the time of war. It is always right there, protecting all humans. Okay, that is international human rights law. Next, when you talk about international humanitarian law, it is even more serious. It is not derogable. It is called as non-derogable. You cannot violate it because it reached the stature of jus cogens, preemptory norm in international law. So even you can violate treaties at times, but you cannot violate these jus cogens norm. These jus cogens norm are superior to the treaties. That's why we call them as the preemptory norms. Okay, so international humanitarian law is non-derogable preemptory norm, which is a jus cogens. But we talk about international humanitarian law, it differs from country to country. See, in India, yes, international humanitarian law is applicable, but our fundamental rights is the transcription of this human rights, and we have quoted different articles and different sections. Okay, that is one thing. And you talk about this human rights law, it can be suspended in countries depending upon the need of the sovereignty. Say, for example, you check Article 358, when we declare national emergency on the basis of war and armed conflict or something. No, not armed conflict. That is the last thing. Okay. External aggression, something like that. Because of war or external aggression, only on these two grounds. Okay. Under Article 358, if national emergency is declared, Article 19 will be automatically suspended. Freedom of speech, right to speak is your human rights. But this human rights can be suspended, can be derogated, depending upon the scenario. But international humanitarian law can never be suspended. We have a war, we have an emergency, you have umpteen number of things, but anything will not touch international humanitarian law. Okay, next, it seeks to protect limiting sufferings from the sufferings which is caused by the war. I told you, right? It is not deciding the legality of the war. It will just check whether the war is done right. Okay, it will try to limit the sufferings caused by the war. Okay, so that is one thing. But when we talk about international international human rights law, it is developed by limiting the state's power. It is telling that it is a check on the sovereign state. Why do you think in our constitution fundamental rights are listed? Why we should have the fundamental rights listed? For that, you have to know Article 12. Article 12 defines state. Why do we even define state? Is because basically now we are implementing fundamental rights even on an individual, but predominantly fundamental rights are enforced against the state. We give sovereignty to the state, complete power to the state. That doesn't mean state can interfere everything on us and limit us and control us and deny us our fundamental rights. That is the reason you list the fundamental rights and say that draw a boundary to the state and say that you shall not step out of them. Okay, that's why we have listed the fundamental rights. So the basic idea, the fundamental rights and the human rights are one and the same. Today in constitution in India, we call it fundamental rights. But these fundamental rights are international human rights. Okay, so what is the idea of human rights? It is all limiting the sovereignty from abusing the citizens, abusing any person, abusing any human. Because you have a big dragon. That's what is our state. Yes, dragon protects us. Dragon goes, brings food and everything. But once dragon gets irritated and start eating us, that must not be done. We created the dragon and dragon has certain rules not to do it. That's what is human rights. Okay, you understand the difference. Now coming to the next thing, that is a mechanism. Any rules, we need some people to monitor it, right? We have some rules in class. We should not speak. We need our class monitor to stand at the corner and write our names in the board, right? Like that, any rules, we need a mechanism to watch over it. And this international humanitarian law is monitored by ICRC. What is ICRC? International Committee of Red Cross. Okay. For monitoring international human rights law, we have different treaty bodies, courts, individuals. We have umpteen number of people. That is different. Now coming to the point, international humanitarian law emphasizes cooperation between parties to conflict. So it always maximum involves different players. Okay, conflicting parties must cause lesser damage. Some cooperation is needed. See, they are already in war. But we are telling, don't take the war beyond humanity. Don't do that. Okay. So they needed some cooperation between the conflicting parties. Yes, I will not bomb your school. You don't do that to me. I won't bomb your hospitals. Then you don't do that to me. Some sort of cooperation between the people at war. You see, it is absurd. But you know what? In World War I, World War II, this world has seen umpteen number of huge violations. But today, at least, we have mitigated that. Till now, we have not seen another atomic bomb. Thankfully, North Korea, Kim Un-jun, that girl's dad doesn't come into the picture. Okay. So, but we don't have another atomic explosion. Okay. That is the effort of international law, actually. We can say that whether there is international law, it is not followed, there is no sanction. But the question is, even in India, how many of us follow the laws? How many of people are getting punished in violation of the laws? We see a lot of corruption. We have to face the truth, right? So we see a lot of corruption, accused walking out, right? So Just because of that, we cannot say that there is no law in India. Like that also, international law may be a weak law, but we do have a law. Okay, so we have to know that. Now, coming to the next question. So basically, we were doing an introduction on international law, and we draw differentiation between international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and then you give a conclusion way forward, finish your answer. Now, coming to 2020 UPSC law optional question. See, all your doubts are coming in the framework of. So I told you international law, like international humanitarian law, applies to armed conflict. Now the next doubt you must get is that whether it is applying to interstate conflict, that is wars between two nations, or it even apply to intrastate conflict, which means inside the state itself there will be some rebellion, right? Whether international humanitarian law applies to that as well, like a civil war. That must be your next doubt. So that doubt is carved out as a question in UPSC. So if you see UPSC, all the gray areas and your doubts, what you're getting, that will be in the paper. Okay. So now coming to the point, what they are asking. They are asking the understanding and scope of legal regimes pertaining to international armed conflict, IAC, and non-international armed conflict. See, international armed conflict, which is a war between two nation states, two countries, and non-international armed conflict means within the country. Okay. And what are the threshold of application of these two regimes? Illustrate the impact of international humanitarian law on international refugee crisis. They are telling even whether this international humanitarian law is having any effect on the refugee crisis. So that's what we are going to answer now. Okay. So what do you think? Where does this international humanitarian law, IHL, applies? We know it applies to armed conflict. So you start from what actually is an armed conflict. You say that international humanitarian law applies to armed conflict. And next you must say what actually is a armed conflict. Armed conflict is a word of wider scope. It is not like war. No formal declaration of war is required. Armed conflict is very simple, arising between the states and leading to the intervention of members of armed forces. Okay, there is some armed force fighting. Either it is between two nation states, two countries, or within the state, you will have a dissent group. You will have A group and just opposite B group. And these group against the own government will show some sort of organization. They'll be like a government. There'll be a president. There'll be all secretary functioning. Everybody will be functioning. They will have funds. They will get weapons. They will have ministries. They will show some sort of organization, and they will be fighting against their particular government to overthrow the government, like a civil war. That is also what? That is an armed conflict. So what is the question? If the members are having armed forces and they are going to fight, that is called as an armed conflict. Okay, so you explain what is armed conflict. And now we are going to distinct international armed conflict. What do you mean by international armed conflict? It is a interstate conflict. Interstate means we have inter-school competitions, right? 3 to 4 schools come together and they do the competition. That's what is interstate. Like that, we have inter-country, inter-nation state. Different countries, foreign elements are involved in international armed conflict. Like the Ukraine-Russia war and like today's Iran war, US war, which is happening now. Okay, all these things. And next type is non-international armed conflict. What is that? It is intra-state. We have intra-school competition. We have intramurals. We call it in our school intramurals, which means within our school itself, the different houses will be competing. You must be participating in that when you were in school. Okay. So intrastate means within the state there is armed conflict, mostly like civil wars. Myanmar civil war, today's happening Sudan civil war, unforgettable Sri Lankan civil war. Okay, so it happens within the state. Now you explain these two wordings that have been given in your question. So always remember, to satisfy the demand of the question, if anything, any keyword is given, you try to explain that keyword as well. Okay, depending upon the time and space that is given. Okay, so you explain these two differences, and then you have to note one thing. Whether when international humanitarian law is discussed in UN, they're not going to discuss like it is in war between nation states, so we are going to condemn it. Even a civil war is condemned in UN. They does not classify the nature of the conflict in UN. Even a forcible mass expulsion, deportation of the people, imprisonment, abuse of the civilians, deliberate attack upon the non-combatants, be it any mode, whether it's inter or intra, they are going to bring that up in the UN Assembly and they are going to talk about it. They are condemning both. So basically, the international humanitarian law applies to international and non-international armed conflict. Whether within your country you are doing a civil war, whether you go beyond and fight with your neighbor, it's not the concern. You are abusing the civilians, war is happening, armed conflict is happening, then international humanitarian law is going to apply there. This is a logical, rational thinking. Okay. So you first give the introduction, then you decipher the difference between two important concepts given, and then you give a rational way. If we say that international humanitarian law is not applying to civil wars, intrastate problems, then there is no purpose of international humanitarian law. Okay, even you may think that someone in the same country will not abuse the people of that country, but that is totally different. We say army is protecting us. Yes, true, army is protecting us. While protecting us, if the army is let loose, the same army can abuse us. That's the truth. Okay, so now coming to the point. So rationally, you talk about this. And then we go to the legal provisions. For that, you have to see Common Article 3. Before knowing what is Common Article 3, for international humanitarian law, we need some international treaty, right? And that treaty is your Geneva Convention. We have 4 Geneva Convention, which is very, very important, and 2 protocols. Now, recently we have 3 protocols. Okay. So, Geneva Convention, which is 4 convention and 3 protocols, is a major part of international humanitarian law. And there is one article called as Article 3, which is common for all these 4 Geneva Conventions. Say, for example, we have, if we talk about criminal law, what comes to your mind? You have CRPC, we have IPC, we have Evidence Act. Now, you don't ask me why don't you mention the new act. That is inherently understood. When I'm talking about old law, new law is as well covered. Okay. So, all these 3 laws says. Maybe I put section 10, and this section 10 is common for all these acts. That is called as common section 10, right? Like that, they have common article 3, which is the same article 3 for all these conventions. So they typically call it common article 3. And this common article 3 talks about the material field of application. You can see in article 1 as well. Okay. So compare these two. They say that it is applied to all armed conflict, be it inter, whatever you may call it. If there is an armed conflict, international humanitarian law is applicable. Okay, and it says that forces any organized armed groups under responsible command exercise such control over the part of its territory. So it is talking about what? Civil war. So even interstate wars and armed conflict are covered. And it also says that situations of internal disturbances, tension, riots, isolated things are not covered. But if it is an armed conflict, it will be covered. Okay, so they give the limit as well. Okay, say for example, we have this farmers riot. In case the farmers are protesting or something, whether that can be armed conflict, and we can say that there is a armed conflict and international humanitarian law applies. No, basically it was a peaceful one. And in I think Manipur, we had a rebellion or something like that. We at certain times we have mob lynching and all. Whether we can say that that is an armed conflict, no. Certain area of organization must be there. It must be widespread that it goes to the limit of armed conflict. Then only international humanitarian law will be applicable. Okay, so all these things you say. And we have an academy called as Geneva Academy conducting a lot of projects. And in that, they talk about armed conflict. They have a separate project for armed conflict. What is armed conflict? What is internal disturbance? You know, this word internal disturbance and armed conflict is not only a confusion in international law, it confused even in India. Even in Indian constitutional framers were confused by this word. Because if you see, for declaring national emergency under Article 352, it can be declared under these grounds. That is war, external aggression, and then internal disturbance. And Indira Gandhi, then Prime Minister, you all know, the Iron Lady of India. Yes, she had many positive things, and one positive or negative thing is that she will declare emergency whenever she wants. So she used the word internal disturbance. So internal disturbance is very, very meager thing. Some disturbance happens, immediately I declare national emergency. So that word was so volatile. So they replaced the word to what? To armed rebellion. Okay. So that's why we have, even in international scenario, they say that internal disturbance, we are not worried about that. International humanitarian law is not going to focus there. But if it is an armed conflict, certain degree of intensity is there beyond internal disturbance and tension. It is something happening. Even be a non-state armed forces, they exhibit a certain level of organization and they are fighting with the state. Then it is an armed rebellion or armed conflict. And then only international humanitarian law applies. Okay. So that we have to say. And then we have to come to, we have completed the answer actually. So basically, when we are talking about the scope of international humanitarian law, it applies to both type of conflicts. Like that, you conclude your answer. Okay. Next, we are coming to from where we derive this international humanitarian law. Yes, every law, international scenario, almost derived from customs. And then we codify it. Okay, so the rules of international customary law is the basics, but we have codified into two huge set of laws. One set is law of Hague, and the next set is law. Okay, so law of Hague is always concerned, it governs the use of force in war. Basically, it is basically it says that how much force you use, how much force is permitted in any law. Okay, I mean any war. Okay, so law of Hague is one set of codified area for international humanitarian law, and law of Geneva is another set. We have 4 conventions and say that we have 3 protocols. Okay, that's why I have marked here 3 protocols. So this is the codified area for international humanitarian law. Together we call this as international humanitarian law. What are these laws? What are these conventions? Never worry. Last few slides list all these conventions. Okay. So now going to the customary part. Because see, now what I told, international humanitarian law is derived from customs. But today we have separate conventions, treaties to implement that. Law of Hague, law of Geneva, we have all these things. Now, what is the use of customs? The next question arises, right? We have a law. Why do we need a custom? What is the relevance of custom on international humanitarian law? in today's scenario. If you get that doubt, you are in the right angle, thinking in the right angle. Okay. Because that's how UPSC is asking the question. So let me tell you what is the relevance. Say, for example, there is this A state and it is doing some war and violating all the international humanitarian law. So suddenly UN, you are the president of UN. So you are the representative of UN or something like that. You go question state A and ask that, see, Mr. A, why are you violating our international humanitarian law? You violate the Geneva Convention. Why do you do that? You are eligible for sanctions. We are going to give sanctions for you. Immediately, the state A will react. See, I am not the party to the Geneva Convention. I did not sign it. So, how you will enforce it on me? Just because I don't sign the international convention, what I can do? I crush the humans. I do the war. And I go beyond the war. I put chemical bomb, I put nuclear bomb, I put biological bomb. And I target hospitals, schools. I kill children. Just because I'm not a signatory. So they can say that, right? That's where the relevance of customary international humanitarian law steps in. Even though the person who is conflicting is not a party to the pertinent convention, we can say that, see, international humanitarian law is a customary rule, it is a preemptory norm, it is a jus cogens. So just because you are not a signatory doesn't mean you can violate the preemptory customary norm. Okay, that is the importance of international customary law. So customary humanitarian law is still applicable. And you talk about one thing. We are intelligent. Humans think, like we think, right? We are very intelligent. We know everything. But whether we can say what is going to happen in future, that is impossible. So without predicting what is going to happen in future, whether we can predict everything and write a specific law for that, not possible. So treaty conventions are human creations. Even in India, every law cannot be predicted. There are a lot of gaps in even in Indian laws. Okay, whatever law it may be, US law also. I saw a video telling that cannibalism is not an offense in US. Then I was thinking whether cannibalism is an offense in IPC or BNS. We don't have a specific section that says that if you eat humans, it is an offense. So whether that means eating humans is allowed, inherently it is allowed. If some person is going to dig up a grave and eat that person, see, you can think like, why ma'am is talking like this? This is so brutal. But I tell you, the place near my school, actually, when I was studying third standard or fourth standard, like 2 bus stops near my school, there was this person who was taking care of that graveyard, and this person will drink alcohol and he will eat the lungs of dead body, it seems. It happened in Chennai. Okay, so if you take the cases and all, it would have happened in almost all the states. So you know where he was punished? There was not a specific law which was telling that you shall not eat humans. There is no law preventing cannibalism. But he was punished for dishonoring the corpus. Okay, so that's the point. There is lacuna. So if a treaty is having a lacuna, a gap, where are you going to fill it? Go bring the international customary humanitarian law. Customs will help you. So it will fill the gaps in the treaty. Okay, that is the second use. Now, how do you fill the gaps in the treaty? That is authorized by the Martens Clause. Okay, when we talk about relevance of international humanitarian law, you give the introduction what I'm talking about. Then you have to talk about the Martens Clause. What is this Martens Clause? It is given under Article 1, Clause 2 of Additional Protocol 1. What is this protocol? What is this convention? See, if we have a law, see, we have an act, right? We have, say, for example, we have this Negotiable Instruments Act. We have IPC, International Penal, Indian Penal Code. Since I'm talking about international law, I told like that. Okay, Indian Penal Code. And we have different acts, huge set of acts. But if we are going to change something in the act, we call it as an amendment act. Like that, if there is a convention, the amendment to the convention is called as protocol. So the Geneva Convention was amended first time, and we call it as additional protocol 1. Okay, in this additional protocol 1, we have article 1 clause 2 talking about Martin's clause. That clause is the Martin's clause. So what exactly Martin's clause talks about? I tell you that. Okay, it says that simply that. Let me give you the clause. This is the clause. Okay, it says that international law is derived from. Let me read the full thing. Civilians and combatants remain under the protection and authority of the principles of international law, derived from established customs. So it says that the entire treaty is derived from the established international custom. So from the principles of humanity and from the dictates of public conscience. Which means in the treaty, if there is no specific article dealing to particular international humanitarian law crisis, you find nothing in the treaty, immediately we will jump to the customary. That's what Martin Clause is saying. Treaty is not talking about anything. You immediately go to the customary international law and get guided by that. Okay, that is what is Martin's Clause. And this was propounded by Professor von Martin, and he is the delegate from Russia. And this word was given in the Hague Peace Conference of 1899. This must be in your introduction. Why do we call it as a Martin's Clause? Is because Professor von Martin from Russia has given this idea. Okay, so you talk about all these things. So this is very important. This Martin's Clause and the relevance of international humanitarian customary law in today's world can appear in your upcoming paper, because I told you, right? This year and maybe next year the war should end basically, but there is no scope of it. So it will be in your UPSC 2026 and 2027 paper. Okay. Now coming to another previous year question. Explain the core principles of international humanitarian law. This is again an important area. When we talk about international humanitarian law, customary law reference is one important area. And what are the core principles? That is another important area. We have 4 core principles that we are going to decipher now. Principle 1, the principle of military necessity. Okay, this principle is both limiting and permissive. It is allowing and it is stopping. Say, for example, you tell to your son, see, you note the point here, not the daughter. You tell to your son that, Mr. Son, you can go out, you can enjoy, I'll give you pocket money, but you must come back at 6 p.m. Okay, like that, if you tell something, it is permissive and limiting. Yes, you can go out. That is permissive. But you have to come back at 6, which is limiting. Like that, the principle of military necessity is both permissive and limiting. To understand this, you must know what is actually principle of military necessity. Wars are condemned. We don't encourage wars. But unfortunately, war is happening. You do the war only for principle of military necessity. You attack the places only it is necessary for getting military necessity for winning the war. Whether if I'm going to attack an hospital, whether that is military necessity, no. I am going to destroy your army base. I am going to destroy a bridge that is going to supply ration to the army base. That is military necessity. I am going to bomb the entire city. Civilians, combatants. There is no military necessity. Okay, so the principle of military necessity says that, as a limiting principle, says that only necessary military forces, lawful forces must be used to achieve the military goals. Excessive violence shall not be used. I want to kill all the person who are fighting against me. I deploy missiles to attack them. After attacking, I take all the women in that area, do a gang rape, kill all the children, hang them everywhere. That is not military necessity. Okay, so you understand, to achieve a military goal, you use a lawful force to achieve only that. No excessive violence. That is the principle of military necessity. This is the limiting factor, limiting side of military necessity principle. Talking about permissive principle, attacking someone, killing someone is not okay. But for the military necessity, you can allow death. For winning over a war, death is allowed, destruction is allowed when necessary, only from the military point of view. Okay, I'll give you examples. We have this Mali destruction of world culture heritage during their civil war in Mali. Okay, and also we talk about Sri Lanka in Jaffna. The museum was totally. It is said that uh, maybe I'm a South Indian, so maybe I'm so attached to it, but that's okay. I love India as a whole. Okay, but when we talk about Tamilians origin and all those things, origin, we see that we had a lot of books relating to that in the Jaffna Museum. But that museum was deliberately destroyed to wipe away that race, it seems. That was not the militariness. Okay, so you give all these examples. Okay, now when you talk about military necessity, you have to understand that you cannot justify the violation of international humanitarian law for the reason of military necessity. For military necessity, I must kill all the children in that place so that nobody grows up and they come to war against me. Nothing like that. Okay, military necessity, you use lawful force to win that particular war. That's all. You don't go extra. That's what is called as principle of military necessity. There can be a question asking you how the principle of military necessity can be both limiting and permissive factor. Okay, it is Article 35, it talks about it. So let me give you the conventions at the end. So you just understand this principle. Okay, Article 35, Para 1. If you're going to be very specific, include the paras, then you will get good marks. Okay. Now, coming to the second principle, which is principle of humanity. You can question me like, see, in war, what is humanity there? Yes, war can be fought like a human. Yes, that's what is today's demand. You see, one good thing about today's war, what is happening in Dubai is that they are pinpointing the places and they are attacking that particular place. They are not doing blanket bombing. If the entire city is wiped out, even killing that Muslim leader, he was particularly bombed in that area. Okay, so that is a good thing. It's bad. I know it's bad, but it is way better than killing all the children and everyone there. Okay, that specifically happens today. So that is principle of humanity. You see this picture. This was done in the war. This may be disturbing to people, but you people must not be disturbed because you people are tomorrow's civil servants. You're going to serve. See all these things for us. Okay. So this is one picture in Russian invasion of Ukraine, and not in now today what is happening, but in Sudan civil war as well, which is happening today. The survivors of Russian occupied areas around Kivik, what happened? There were gang rapes. Assaults were taking place at the gunpoint. Rapes were committed in front of the children. It was so inhuman that even children was killed in an inhuman way. They took out the eyes, all sorts of things. I need not explain. If you go Google, you will see for yourselves. We had this killing chambers created by Hitler, right? They are sometimes called as power chambers, it seems, because you kill the enemy people, you put them inside a small room like thing, hundreds of people in small room, and you electrocute them, or you have a small chimney on top and you flame them. Everybody is boiled. Now, all the soldiers who are doing this, enjoying this, will get a power, it seems. They call it as power chambers sometimes. Okay, so where is the principle of humanity? That's where international humanitarian law demands. What is the importance? The military necessity should be counterbalanced by the principle of humanity. What principle we saw there? Yes, for military necessity, death is inevitable, means you do the death. Death is allowed. But you follow the principle of humanity and do it. How do you do it? You don't kill anyone who's not participating in the war. Leave the non-combatants. And also it says that who are no longer actively participating in war. I may be a person who had the AK-47 and was involved in war. It is my past tense. But today I'm not doing it. Leave me. I am also a non-combatant. Okay, that's what they are telling. Provide for human treatment of all at all times. This is not going to happen. But at least we have a law telling that don't do this. Okay, that's what it is. Next, when we talk about combatants means even a soldier is fighting against you, give him a soldier's death. You take him, butcher him into pieces, and then make a curry out of him and eat. You can think like, why ma'am is talking like this, but this is happening. You people know better than me. Okay, that's why I tell you. So, you want to kill the person directly who are involved, hostile, you cause injury, but don't do superfluous injury. Don't do unnecessary suffering. Give them the soldier's treatment. That is called as principle of humanity. So, from the principle of military necessity, this is counterbalanced by the principle of humanity. You have to connect like this, your answers. Okay. And next we have to talk about principle of distinction. Let me put the light. It is very dark over here. One sec. Yeah. Principle of distinction. What do you mean by principle of distinction? This is given under Article 48 of Additional Protocol for Geneva Convention. It says that you distinguish between combatants and civilians. Then you harm him. Immediately you can ask me a question. Ma'am, I will know the difference. How the bomb will know the difference between the combatant and the non-combatant. If I bomb a particular area, it is going to be a blanket removal. Everyone will be affected. How my bomb will know it? You can ask that question. That's where there is an objection of distinction comes in. It says that you must know your object of attack, from where you're using it. If the weapon is incapable of distinguishing between civilian and military targets, if your weapon is of that nature, don't use that weapon. That is the principle of distinction. At least in today's war, they are following this. But I think there was a elementary school which was bombed and a lot of kids died. I think so. But this is all prohibited. We can call the nation for war crimes. They will call after 5 years, after 10 years, and whether we get justice, that is different. But at least we have a law. Okay, that's all. So, what is principle of distinction? It is given in Article 48. That's very important. We have to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, and between military objects and civilian objects, and then we have to attack it. If per se your weapon is not able to distinguish between these two, then don't use such weapon is the principle. Okay, we shall not attack schools, we shall not attack hospitals, we shall not attack any area which has that Red Cross symbol. But what they will say immediately in the tribunals and all, what they will say? They will say that behind the school there was a defense system. They had this school as a cover up. That's what they will say. I'm telling you, we have a principle. Okay, that's it. And then I told you, right, all these principles have reached the stage of pre-entry norm. that was recognized in this particular case. They have reached the area of just cogence. Okay, that is important. Now we saw all the principles. Now we have to see what is just cogence. Just cogence, we call it as it has the basis in natural principles of law. We have constitution. We have umpteen number of acts that we read every day and get fed up. If you are a law student, if you are an advocate, yes, we fall in love with law. But at the same time, someday we will feel like, see, turn back and see how many laws and sections I have read. All my human chapter, if you see, it drowns with law. Okay. Although we have so much laws, what's the basis of these laws? Logic and that is a natural law principle. If you don't have any law in that particular area, then principles of natural justice will be guiding it. Like that, just cogence is also rooted in natural legal principles. So if there is any treaty law that is going to come in conflict with this just cogence, then the treaty law is null and void. Any act is going to conflict with your constitution. They are null and void. Constitution is supreme. Like that, just cogence in international law is a preemptory norm and it is supreme. Any treaty is going to violate it, treaty will die away. Okay, that's very important. So what are these just cogence? What we were talking now, the principle of distinction, the principle of humanity is all just cogence. But it is violated every day. That's another thing. Please don't take your mind there. But these are the laws right there. Okay. So war, aggression, genocide, attacking civilians, everything are all just cogence. It is the international responsibility of the state for violations. Any state can condemn the other state for doing it. Okay, that's the important thing. And next principle is principle of proportionality. If your sister is going to hit you like this on your head, what we do, we act sometimes disproportional. Maybe I take a glass and I put on her. I'm not going to take a big cane or something, take my laptop and smash her head. I'm not going to do that. We do some proportional reaction. If your friend is going to tap like this, a harder one, we will say, if we are very soft, we will say that next time, please don't do it. I don't like it. Something like that. If we are very there in a bad mood or something like that, already thinking we have prelims, GS, and we have law optional as well, and we are frustrated, and suddenly you'll turn back and give a smack, telling that how you feel now. Like that only I felt. Okay, so we do something proportional. That's what is this principle of proportionality. For the lawful military objective, what is expected to achieve that objective? Say in case there is this particular area occupied by the dissent group or something, what you have to do? You have to chase them away. It is not that you kill everyone there, go beyond, arrest everyone, bring back, torture them to death. That is not needed. So for the lawful military objective, what may be expected to do that? You do only that force. You shall not result in excessive civilian harm. Okay, that is principle of proportionality. I am going to kill my enemy. I can go drop missiles, but I choose to drop chemical bombs so that they all evaporate like nothing. I'm going to directly put atomic bombs. I'm going to do a biological warfare. I go inject something in someone's body. Everybody is going to get that particular flu and everybody is going to die like a very, very bad death. Okay, something like that. Biological warfare. That cannot be done. Okay, so that is the principle. Proportional things. So you do such harm, but you shall not use uselessly aggravating suffering shall not be done. You don't have unlimited freedom of choice and means in the weapons you use. I cannot have unlimited freedom like gas chambers was used in World War II by Hitler, right? Like that I cannot use. I have limited choice of weapons. Okay, that is principle of proportionality. Okay. And all these principles are ratified into Hague and Geneva Conventions. I'll tell you where it is ratified. The particular article is given as well, and the convention is given at the end. Okay, you can relate. Now, coming to the next question. Explain the concept of international humanitarian law, how it can be achieved, and critically examine the role of Hague and Geneva Convention in the development of modern international law. So whatever I told now, what is the concept? I was giving all the introduction, right? That is the concept. How it can be achieved is by following all the laws that we are going to see now. So now it demands what are the conventions? What are the 4 conventions that we are going to see now? But before that, we will go for a 10 minutes break and come back at 6:15. We will complete the class by 6:30. Okay. So we'll go for a 10 minutes break and come back. Yes. So we are going to decipher the codified area of international humanitarian. I told that there are 4 conventions, Geneva Conventions of 1949, 4 conventions, and 3 amendments, additions to these conventions, which is called as protocols. We have 3 protocols. Okay. So the first Geneva Convention protects the wounded and the sick soldiers on the land during the war. So you can ask me, we have war which is happening even in ocean. We have all our submarines. Why it is not covered? Yes, it is not covered in this particular convention. It is covered in the next convention. So first Geneva Convention of 1949 protects the wounded sick soldiers only on the land during the war. So what is the scope? It protects the wounded and the sick. Okay. It gives the it even protects the medical and religious personnel also, but we have separate convention to protect them as well. We have a separate protocol at the end as well. But basically, this convention is only for the wounded and the sick soldiers. Okay. It says that medical facilities must be established, and these medical facilities and hospitals shall not be war targets. But unfortunately, in any war, there is an hospital which is bombed, but it is not legal. See, if they say that bombing an hospital is legal, if there is no rule to check that, that is even worse. At least we have a rule. The established rule is that a medical facility shall not be a war target, and that hospital must treat all the wounded impartially. Say, for example, there is a war between A state and the B state. The hospital is established by the A state. Even it should take care of a soldier of the opposite state, warring nation. The hospital must treat all the wounded impartially. That is the second requirement. Third thing, the civilians aiding the wounded shall be protected. So, the doctors, the nurses, there are volunteers, even civilians helping these wounded shall not be the target of war. They must be protected. Okay. And there will be Red Cross symbol identifying the person, as well as they will be having Red Cross badge, and also the place will be identified by the Red Cross. Okay, that area should not be targeted. And we have an annexure calling for hospital zone identification and identity cards to be provided to these medical peoples and religious personnel who are involved there, so that they shall not be the target of the war. Okay, so that and all was provided in the annexure itself. What must be the identity card, how it should be, model identity card and all is given. Now coming to the second Geneva Convention, it protects the wounded and the sick, but it is about the war which is happening at sea. It takes regard of the shipwrecked military personnel at sea during the war. That is the second Geneva Convention. Okay, it actually replaced the Hague Convention of 1907. And then we have this convention now, what we are following today. So it is almost same. Whatever we saw in the land, it is same applicable to the ships. Okay, it also contains 63 articles and it talks about war at sea, and it says that hospital ships must be protected, model identity cards are given, symbols are given. Whatever I told earlier, that is for land, applies even for sea, but in the next convention. That is the only difference. Okay. And next, when we have to talk about common things on land and sea. Okay, both the conventions, only difference is land and sea. But what it is spelling out, what are the important principles that commonly we can read? Okay, it says that at sea, emphasis we have to see that whether organized forces or something duly, which is getting into war, they must protect the wounded, sick, and shipwrecked people. Same in land also. Okay. And any soldiers you take them, any person you capture, they must be treated humanly, which means they must be respected and protected at all circumstances. Leave the injury that you are causing, leave the torture that you are doing. Apart, see, even reputation shall not be harmed, it seems. We must treat them with utmost respect. But that is different. But this law demands that you respect them, you protect them, you treat them humanly, you don't discriminate them. Okay, that is one thing. And next it says that torture or biological experimentation is forbidden. Why they have to forbid biological experimentation? We saw all the ugliest war crimes in World War II and World War One. Hitler used to capture all the twins, it seems, even Mussolini. Okay, he will subject the twins to a lot of like operations and medical experiments, it seems. Even anesthesia will not be used. In a span of 30 days, they will undergo 60 operations. Okay, so they shall not be subject to torture or biological experimentation, which is totally forbidden. Okay, and take possible measures to protect the wounded, sick, and ensure that they get adequate care. Okay, that is very important. And they have to search for the dead and prevent their despoil. Despoiled means I had I had close opportunity to listen to the refugees from Sri Lankan war. Like seeing people in video talking about documentaries is okay. But I had this opportunity because I was living just near a camp. So they become friends and we share food like that. Okay. But they were not allowed to come out of the camp at the initial time. So we will go visit with food and all those things. Okay. So one fine day, I had to talk with one of my friends. She's now in London. So they got deported back and she had an opportunity to go settle there. And she told me when she's going to market, she will see heap of humans dead at the corner of the street. So whoever is dead during the bombing, they will drag them and put at one corner of the street for the time being, and then everybody will go dig a huge pit, put the people inside and close it. Only after identification. So before identification, say for example, we have this lunch bag kept at the door of our schools. Sometimes when mothers and all will bring the lunch bag, they will leave the lunch bag there and we will go identify and take it, right? Like that, all dead bodies, children's remains will be piled up. Okay, so this is also inhuman. So what the occupied force must do, they must collect the dead and prevent them being spoiled and give them a honored cremation. Okay, that is also given. And we have to provide medical establishments and units, and these units, if established, shall not be attacked, and they will be recognized under the symbol, which is a red cross symbol. It is also called as a red crescent symbol is also given. Apart from cross, they use crescent also sometimes. And now after protocol 3, they are using the red diamond symbol, because cross they give a religious name to it, and crescent they give a religious name to it, color to it. Now we use the red diamond symbol. It will be like a ruby thing. It will be like a diamond symbol. Okay, I'll show you that as well. So protocol 3 only introduced this red diamond symbol and says that if you see a red diamond, you will not do what? You will not attack that site. Okay. Now going to the third Geneva Convention. This convention talks about prisoners of war. First, we have to know who are prisoners of war. Yes, it is defined under this convention that we will decipher in next 5 minutes. Okay. We have 143 articles in this convention, and this convention categorizes, declares certain people as prisoners of war who are entitled to the status of prisoners of war, and what protection we have to give them. What should be the conditions and places of captivity? What labor they must be involved in, and what financial resources that must be given. If any judicial proceedings, how it should be instituted against them. And if at all the war is over, there is cessation of hostility, that too active hostility. War declared, fought, won, and it's over, and still you hold the persons as prisoners of war and torture them. That's not right. So once the hostility, that too active hostility ends, you have to release and repatriate them, send them. Okay, that is mandated in this prisoners of war convention, third convention. I'm going to explain that in detail because it was a specific question asked in previous year UPSC. Okay. So you have to spell out the general detail of prisoners of war, how prisoners of war must be treated. That is Geneva Convention, third convention. So to treat some person, we have to know who is that person. So who are prisoners of war, determining that point, who is prisoners of war, who is entitled to that status, is articulated in Article 4. Article 4 says that any people involved in armed conflict is prisoners of war. Any organization in armed conflict, they are responsible for the subordinates. They are having a distinctive symbol which is recognized from an area. They are carrying arms openly, and they are operating under certain laws and customs. Say for example, there is a civil war, there are three groups. One group is A group, which is holding a flag, B flag, C flag, like that. Each group, if captured, it is a prisoner of war. They get that status. They show some organization. They have a distinctive sign. They have some subordinates to follow instructions. They have laws, customs, everything for fighting a war. Then that organization is also, if captured, they will be prisoners of war. Okay, it doesn't mean that only we segregate only certain people and they are prisoners of war. We are protecting only them. We will kill whoever comes from this organization. No, it's not like that. So even organizations can be getting the status of prisoners of war. Okay. And other soldiers of not recognized organization. There are few people who carry arms. They are soldiers, but you're not able to identify to which group they belong. Just because of that, you cannot mistreat them. Okay, even other soldiers who are not recognized by the detaining power are also prisoners of war. There are these people who will be accompanying the armed conflicts, like the contractors, labor units, something like that. Even these people are arrested, they get the status of prisoners of war. Members of any crew, everything. Inhabitants of non-occupied territory. Okay, like see, these people will be like joining in forces and they'll be fighting. Okay, they will resist the invading, but they are not part of the army. Say, for example, this happened in Northeast. Actually, many people will comment that Northeast not a part of India, they are China something, but a true Indian will not. They are more Indian than any Indian here. what happened is that there were some aggression from China in Arunachal Pradesh or somewhere. Immediately, the local people formed a group and started attacking, capturing. These local people are not soldiers, but they are attacking. They formed an army. They are not army actually, but they are resisting the invading forces. So if these people are captured also, they are just inhabitants, they are just people of that place. If they are captured as well, they get the status of prisoners of war. You can ask me the status of prisoners of war, whether it is a medal, why it is very precious. Yes, it is precious. If you are declared only as a prisoner of war, you get all the rights which is promised under this convention. Okay, so all these peoples are prisoner of war. And if you are past tense, earlier you belong to the armed forces, now you are liberated. Now you are no more the part of armed forces, but you are captured. Even if you are neutral now, if you are captured, you are prisoner of war. Okay, so these are people are all prisoner of war. Why we are identifying these people is because now we are going to see how these people must be treated, how prisoners of war must be treated. That's the main objective, right? That's what we are going to see now. Okay, they must be kept alive, not in a bad condition, but in a good health. They must be humanly treated. But the problem is, even the country will not deal with its own citizen like this. We have a law that you remember. They must be kept alive. POWs, prisoners of war, must be kept alive, that too in good health, and they must not be subject to any insults, and they must not be kept as a public curiosity. You cage them, kept in a mid, you keep them in a middle, show them as an example, throw stones at them. Don't do that. Okay. Next, you shall not create any reprisal, retaliation against them. Yes, they fired us, they did this, so we are going to do that back. Don't do that. And you respect the persons again, honor the persons again. You divulge their names, date of birth, their rank and serial numbers, but protect their privacy. That means, see, you just put their names, any numbers, identifications in your role and all, but there are some private things you shall not disclose. If that is the case, protect the privacy of the prisoner of war. That is there, but it's not followed. Okay. Next thing, Article 17 says that no physical or mental torture or any form of coercion be inflicted on them to get any information of any kind. But it is all just opposite happening. But we have Article 17. Okay. Article 118 says that after the war is over, your hostility is over, they shall be released. It is not may, they may be. It is a shall provision. Shall be released and repatriated back to their territories. So this is what Convention on Prisoners of War, which is the third Geneva Convention, gives you. Okay, this is very important. You have to know everything. And next, whatever I told you, put side headings and write the content. Okay. Next, we are going to see the fourth Geneva Convention. It is talking about protection of civilians in the occupied territory. What is actually a occupied territory is also defined here. Okay, so occupied territory is given below, but let me tell you, it is like uh, like protecting the civilians in any area of war, whether the territory is occupied or not, it is applicable. But in occupied territory also, it specifically applies. That we have to know. Okay. In World War II, see all these conventions, even our United Nation is the birth from the World War II. World War II is a disaster. So from saving us from these disastrous consequences only, we have all these conventions. That should be your introduction. Okay. And it composes of 159 articles. The fourth convention, final convention. Okay. So what is occupied territory? See, occupied territory means territory occupied by the hostile forces. Say, for example, there is a war between US and UK. It should not happen. But if it is, and US occupies certain area of UK, that is the US occupied area of UK, like that. Okay, that's very important. So what is the scope of this convention is that it deals with the treatment of enemy aliens in the territory which was occupied. I go occupy my enemy's territory, how I should treat my enemies. That's what is given here. Okay. And it is supplemented by additional protocol 1 also that you have to write. So what we have to do, we have to distinguish between civilians and combatants, between civilians and military objectives. I told, right, principle of distinction that is given under Article 48 of Additional Protocol 1. So you don't, how you behave in the occupied territory. You don't bomb everyone. You differentiate combatants and non-combatants and treat them accordingly. You don't bomb all the houses. You find out which is military target and go only for that. Principle of distinction. Okay. And that's what we have to talk. We have to save the civilian population and must not attack them. That is given under Article 51, Clause 4. So carpet bombing of the cities is not allowed. I told you, right? The bomb will not distinguish who's right or wrong. My pistol will not distinguish who's right or not wrong. My missile is very big. It's going to wipe away your city. It will not know what it is doing. That shall not be your answer. If your weapon is not capable of distinguishing, don't use the weapon. That's what is Article 51 Clause 4 is telling. Carpet bombing of the cities is not allowed. Okay. And then we have to talk about military objectives, which means military. What is military objective? Something is giving you a military advantage. That is a military objective. Say, for example, this is the bridge, and you have your enemy's military camp here, and the food for this camp and all the weapons for this camp is carried through this bridge. Whether this bridge is a military target, you tell me. If you're not going to answer, I'm going to
Yes,
end the class.
yes,
Yes, right. Yeah. So this bridge, even though civilians are using it, this bridge is harmless per se, but it is your military objective and it can be blasted. That's what happened in Crimea Bridge. Russian supplies were hindered by blasting the Crimea Bridge. We have this Crimea documentary itself. If you find time, just watch it for 5 minutes. They will plan to disconnect the entire military base from the mainland. Okay, that too, Russia is half of cold desert. So if no food, automatically they are going to perish. Okay, like that they planned. Okay, so if some destruction is going to give you a military advantage if destroyed, captured, or neutralized, then that is the military objective and you can destroy it. That is given under Article 52. So this article can be related to the principle of military necessity, the principle which we saw. Okay, and next, bombing of mutations factory. Everything is lawful. If you're going to bomb a factory which is creating bombs, missiles, everything, neutralizing a nuclear power plant, that's all legal. But when you're neutralizing those areas, if the adjacent area is going to be affected, that is called as collateral damage. Yes, it is allowed. Sometimes when our mother is scolding us, what she will tell, no, you're not going to be a right person. You're not going to do anything. You're only fit to raise buffaloes. Like that, she will be telling us, right? And in meantime, she will also tell, oh, how you are going to be a good person because you have a friend like XXX. This XXX is also a useless person. You are also a useless person. So the damage main aim is to damage us. But who is collaterally damaged? Our friend is also collaterally damaged. Like that. There are military targets. But in destroying this military target, there can be some collateral damage, which is horrifically allowed. Okay. So that also you have to see. Next, apply strategic target like roads, bridges, power stations, airports will be the main targets which will give military advantage because you destroy the airports. Most domestic airports are used for military purpose. Okay, like that. I think in Hyderabad, they use the airport for dual purpose, and also I think in Bagdora airport they use it for dual purpose. In India, we have lots of airports like that. So those airports destruction is also military objective. It is allowed. Okay. Next, civilian officials like ministers or something like any radio transmissions, like ministries, places, and all are legitimate military targets. It seems you have the ministry. So if you destroy the ministry, it means you have captured that place, something like that. Yes, that is the proper military target. Actually, half of the world says it is. Half of the world says no, it is not. So now it remains a difficult question whether government ministries, maybe Supreme Courts, parliaments, like that areas are legitimate military targets. So the point is, it differs from circumstance to circumstance. So depending upon the circumstance, it can be the targeted area. If all our military is going to pull up in our parliament and they are going to fight for the opposite enemy, that can be a military target. Okay, it depends upon the circumstances. Now, who is a civilian and what is her rights? That is given under Article 50, Clause 1 of Protocol 1. So any person who's not fighting, non-combatant, is a civilian. They must be respected. The honor must be protected. Their religious practice must be allowed. They must not be tortured. See, if they keep us alive itself, it's a big thing. But these rights are there. Okay. Respecting the person, honoring the person, don't torture, don't cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment must not be there. Do not take them as a hostage. Okay, all these things are given. Next, protection. Where and from whom? I told you, right? Occupied territory. I gave you the definition. It is defined under Article 42 of this convention. Occupied territory is that enemy is going to occupy your enemy's territory. That's what is occupied territory. Okay, that's all. You just read this. And finally, I have to talk about 5 more minutes. Don't worry, because these things are quite important. I have to explain. Okay. So we will wind up soon. We have to talk about Common Article 3. What is this Common Article 3? I told you, right? We have 4 conventions. And if you see Article 3 of all these 4 conventions, it is the same thing. It is common to all the 4 conventions. You know, one convention applies on land, one convention applies on sea, one convention is for prisoners. Like that, we have different areas of operation. The concept under Article 3 is common to everyone, every convention. That's why we call it as Common Article 3. This Common Article 3 only established the fundamental rules. This Common Article 3 only is a major preemptory norm which cannot be derogated. Very important. It is very important that you have to write about this as well. Okay. So it talks about human treatment for all persons, even in enemy hands, treat them properly. You should not murder, mutilate, torture, cruel, humiliate them. Okay. And if you find any person wounded, sick, and shipwrecked, you care for them. You take care of them. And ICRC, International Committee for Red Cross, will offer their service to the parties of conflict. They will protect these people. See, these people are fighting. Who will protect you? This ICRC is coming for your protection. Whether they are active and all, that is different. We have someone's presence there. Okay, they will do it. We have one ad telling that somebody is dying. I'm noting it down. And somebody is tortured. I'm noting it down. Somebody is like raped. I'm noting it down. And one person will come and ask, who are you? You're not helping anyone. You're just noting everything down. Yes, I am the peacekeeping force from United Nations. That's what is happening. At least someone is there noting it down. Later point of time, they establish a tribunal, ask a question. Something is done, right? That is one small positive thing. Okay. So that's what ICRC will be doing. Next, Geneva Convention into force. So, see, they have a special agreements and all. It says that any party who is conflicting all these conventions, they must be held responsible. Okay, that is one part of your Common Article 3. Now we have completed all 4 conventions, we have come to the additional protocols. So we have two additional protocols. The first protocol strengthens the victims of international conflict. First protocol deals with international conflict, that is, two states are fighting, nation states. Second protocol deals with non-international conflict, that is intra-state, within the state civil wars. There it is protected. And you have this third protocol, it came in 2005. It gives you the symbol of red crystal. I'll bring you the red crystal. This is a red cross symbol. I'll show you the red crescent as well. I will put in the group, in the WhatsApp group. And we have now red crystal symbol that is given in the third protocol. That's all. Okay. So about these protocols, just mention one line. That is enough. Okay. So I have listed it here. Read after the class. So this is where the protocols are dealing. Now, I told you international humanitarian law has two big sets. One is the Geneva Convention. That is the core area where question will be asked. We have covered everything. Next is the Law of Hague. There you have all these conventions, regulations for warfare. I request you to read them after the class. If you are able to mention 5 to 6 points from this, that is totally enough. But there have been no specific question on Hague Convention at all. But in case if they ask, you must be able to write at least 5 to 4 points. See, everything is quite simple. If you read, you will remember certain things. So try to remember 6 to 7 conventions. And if question is asked, try to put them in the paper. That's all. Okay, this is a peripheral area. You can read it after the class. So if you're having any doubts, you can ask me. If there is no doubts, we can end the class. Any doubts? Understood today's class? You people are having any doubts, please do put it in the group as well. So if I come across any doubts in the group, I will personally answer it back to you. Okay. So somehow you people have to prepare and clear and finish it off. Okay. Don't take attempts. That's my request. So thankfully, we will rest today's class and meet you on Monday. Thank you so much.